All right, everybody, we're going to start to kick off here. If you could head to your seats, please. And actually, I misspoke. The first thing we're going to do, because we're a great group of Americans, we're going to kick off by reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. So if you please stand up. We got a flag right over here. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, Dane County, welcome. Well, hey, we are thrilled to be here in Dane County. No Better Friend Corporation has not had or hosted an event here in a little bit, and I think some of you know why. It's been a little bit hard to operate in Dane County recently. We did get a letter, like a cease and desist letter at one point from the Dane County Health Board, I think, telling us that they had photo evidence that we might have been in your county and warning us not to come back. And I'm not making that up, actually. Vicki McKenna and I talked about this on air once. It was pretty crazy. But in any case, we are back, and we are thrilled that you are here. Give yourselves a hand for coming out in a tornado watch. I love it. So before we get into our speakers tonight and talk a bit more about the content of tonight's presentation, I'm going to give a very quick overview of just No Better Friend Corporation, who we are, what we do, and what we're operating around the state. So with that, if we could, I don't have control of the presentation, but that's a quick slide that we put together on just the naming of No Better Friend. And if you've been to a few of our events or been to any of our events, frankly, you might have heard me say this before. In essence, I ran for the United States Senate in 2018. I lost that primary. And since then, it's been a real rough go of it for conservatives in the statewide elections in Wisconsin. To that end, conservatives in the state of Wisconsin have now lost 11 out of 12 statewide races since 2018. And that's a real problem. It's a real problem because we see what's happening on the other side of the ledger and what's coming from the left and how it's attempting to basically disrupt society. So people that supported me in that primary, and frankly some that didn't, came to me and said, what are we going to do to grow our movement? What are we going to do to grow conservatism in the state of Wisconsin and actually chart a path forward as a society that makes sense, frankly, and that encourages success? And I said, well, one of the things we could do is start a group like this that would operate around the state, would literally meet people where they're at, talk to them about the issues that they care about, and actually explain how conservative ideas empower people, make them successful, and put them on a better trajectory in life. And that's what No Better Friend's been doing ever since. The name itself comes from a tagline that's put on Marines called No Better Friend, No Worse Enemy. Some of you may know I was a Marine Corps. Yep, there you go. I'm a Marine Corps veteran, and I hear a couple other Marines out there. I had a great idea. I was like, we're going to name this group No Worse Enemy. And my wife, Jessie, who's here tonight, said, no, you're not. But No Better Friend would be great. And so I said, yeah, I'll take her advice. She's better at branding and marketing than I am. So here we are, No Better Friend. And if you could flip to the next slide, we've got a series of core pillars that we focus on around the state. And again, this is everything from advertising and messaging and reaching people to actually physical events that we're doing around the state. We believe that, number one, that policymakers should be pushing for ideas and policies that actually create economic growth. Sounds super simple, but let's look at the current administration in the White House right now and just say that guy got into office, and within a couple hours, what is he trying to do? Drive up the cost of energy and drive up the cost of labor. You may not remember that, said this gentleman. But in any case, whoever signed those orders did remember that. And the problem is that that's the kind of stuff that actually kills opportunity for people. We as conservatives can't just talk about, we want taxes low. We want taxes low because we don't want to see waste. We don't want to see wealth wasted on things that don't make sense. But we really want to see growth and empowerment. We want to see opportunity. And the ideas that come from the left crush that in so many different respects. And we have to call that out and call it for what it is. Beyond policies that encourage economic growth, we at No Better Friend do a ton of work, separate from critical race theory, on education reform. We're huge advocates of school choice. We believe, and Wisconsin has a great legacy in school choice, that yes, and you should give the state of Wisconsin a round of applause for what it's done in school choice. But we believe that there should be a market available to families so that when traditional public schools or any given school is not performing the way it should, families can make choices that make sense, because there is nothing that we can do which will more critically change the trajectory of a life than getting a kid in a school that is going to offer them a better education. I should say the most important thing is family. Separate from family, it's getting kids in schools that can actually put them in a better trajectory in life. So we're out there fighting for that. We had an event here in Dane County at the Capitol, which we worked with some great partners. You might have heard about in the news. We got 1,000 kids, this is before COVID, into the state capitol. The Vice President Pence flew in, and those kids were there to celebrate their education and the fact they were part of Wisconsin's school choice programs. 1,000 kids showed up. Many of them from very disadvantaged backgrounds who were in good schools and who were smarter than I was at their age because they were actually celebrating their education. I don't think I would have been doing that when I was their age. Guess who ran out of the building and hid? Your governor, Tony Evers. Talk about a photo op. 1,000 kids showed up. 1,000 kids showed up to celebrate their education. He ran away. We scared him out of the building. Do you think we can do that again? I think we can too. So we have to think about that critically, but the idea is get families the ability to get their kids into better situations. Our group works with crisis pregnancy centers around the state of Wisconsin. Many of you may or may not know my story, but I was not raised to be pro-life. I had to figure this out on my own. I had my own children. I saw innocent life thrown away in combat, and I came to understand the obligations that I have as just an individual, let alone a parent, to be out there fighting for innocent life. Well, we work with, and we just had an event, I think about a couple months ago. There's about 60 crisis pregnancy centers in the state of Wisconsin. Over a third of them, for the first time, got together with us, along with Pro-Life Wisconsin, Wisconsin Right to Life, and Wisconsin Family Action, all together in the same place to actually network and to talk about how to do the job of meeting people where they're at and getting them to embrace and protect innocent life even better. I'm incredibly proud of that. Our team did a wonderful job of assembling that, and that's just the start of the work that we're doing with crisis pregnancy centers and our major pro-life groups throughout the state of Wisconsin to protect innocent life. Beyond that, market forces in healthcare. Is anybody hearing any good ideas on healthcare in our public debate right now? That's a problem. It's a problem because we're going to talk about some very important things tonight, but guess what? Even if we get all this fixed, healthcare is going to bankrupt us. It's our long-term obligations and promises that have us on a trajectory which is financially unsustainable as a country. We have to get things like price transparency, real consumer choice into healthcare. I spoke on this just recently at Concordia University, and we need to put more good ideas like that. And I'll laud the Trump administration because they did take a first step, forcing hospital providers to actually publish some of their prices. It's a first step in a long journey, but it's the kind of thing that we need to be doing a lot more of. And then last, I'll note the belief that a strong national defense stops wars before they start. I fought in 2 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Put simply, I do not want your children or my children fighting in the same wars that I did. I don't think that that's constructive. I think that at the end of the day, by presenting a strong face, a strong national defense, bad guys actually do pay attention. If you see what's happening today in Iran through their support of Hamas and Hezbollah, they have obviously kicked it up a notch, put recently. And they have launched aggression on Israel, which is more likely to lead to more conflict in the future, not to resolve it. And I think one of the important things we have to say to the people of the state of Wisconsin is this. At the end of the day, yes, pick your leftist politician. They can say they hate war. Well, I hate war too, probably more than they do because I've seen it up close. But I know that we can actually stop wars by being smart and strategic and presenting a real defense in the first place. And that is what the people of Wisconsin need to hear in terms of our conservative belief system. So that's No Better Friend, and that's what we'll continue to do, and we're thrilled. And you might say, okay, well, critical race theory, how does that fit into this? Well, it cuts across so many different parts of this. At the end of the day, our nation, and I talked to Vicki McKenna about this earlier today, our nation got a lot of things right at its founding, imperfect as that founding may have been. At the end of the day, it created this concept, this idea that you as an individual matter, that your rights are given to you by God, and your government doesn't get to take them away from you. That's core, it's essential, it's real. It's a result of a lot of critical thought, the kind of critical thought you're going to hear tonight from our speakers. It's well thought out, it's constructed, it's Lockean, and it's been, again, put into writing in a way that people could think about it further and then put it into practice in government. We are at risk of losing that. Because make no mistake, what we're about to talk about tonight, which you can hear from our great speakers, is the fact that critical race theory is, at the end of the day, an attempt to upend all that, to replace the value of the individual with collective guilt and collective accusation and collective responsibility in a way that simply is not compatible with a free republic. So with that, if you could flip the page here. Okay, so what I'm going to do is jump into just a bit of an introduction before we bring up our first speaker on critical race theory itself. And I want to say that today as we sit here now, 2021, roughly 2/3 of Americans, 65%, would say that race relations in America are bad. That number was 40% in 2009. And the problem clearly goes beyond simply the political arena. As we're going to learn tonight, identity politics, which is a bit of what I talked about when I ran for the Senate in 2018, is just one of so many different outcroppings of the fundamental lies of critical race theory. Ultimately, CRT, critical race theory, is a form of Marxism that replaces Marx's concept of a conflict between capitalists and the proletariat as one between warring coalitions based on race. The goal of those who push CRT seek to make race central to all aspects of your life, your family's life, your friend's life, and your children's life in a way that you can never move beyond it. And all this is being done in service to setting up a struggle for political power and control that was, in fact, envisioned by Marx and is now carried out by others. The goal of those who push CRT is to encourage collective distrust, collective guilt, collective blame, and to tear down the idea that the country was founded on the fact that the individual matters and was granted rights by God. And the individual, ultimately, in our system, both reaps what they sow in terms of productivity and also, too, is responsible for their actions, both good and evil. Note that advocates of CRT have worked diligently to replace the concept of equality, which is core to our American experiment, with the word equity, which is specifically equity of outcomes as designated by bureaucrats and the political extreme left. As the goals and flaws of CRT have been called out, you've been noting the gaslighting that has been occurring, which our speakers will talk about tonight, which basically tries to tell you this isn't real, it's not happening. Have you heard that? Well, that's the reason we're doing these events and bringing these incredible speakers to you, because it is happening, and it is materially different, or you wouldn't all be here tonight. Common sense will rule the day, and that's what will rule the night here tonight as we talk about defining critical race theory, its effects, and what it truly is. We here, as conservatives, believe that history, math, science, all of it should be taught. Warts and all, the good, the bad, the ugly. That's real, and it should be shared with everybody. But it should be done in context. It should be treated with seriousness. It should not be politicized. And the problem with critical race theory, among other problems, is it attempts to erode that context, to eliminate it, and to convince people that the freest, most wonderful society in the world, where hundreds of millions of people over time have strove and fought to move to, is somehow inherently evil. And we know that that's materially different than what's been done in the past. So as we sit here today, yes, we are happy to celebrate Juneteenth and what it meant in the context. And we're also going to talk about the fact that it came at the end of a bloody civil war in which many hundreds of thousands of Americans lost their lives, their limbs, their property in so many different ways in order to help realize the American dream for everybody. So we think about this critically. We talk about it here tonight. We will not accept a teaching of American history that very intentionally twists reality in an effort to deny the fact that the United States of America has freed more souls, enabled more opportunity, and realized more dreams than any other human-made institution in history. We will not accept political extremists worming their way into our schools, our military, our corporations in order to insert divisive politics into minds, while simultaneously reducing academic standards, setting people back, and leaving them unprepared for a globally competitive work environment. We will not accept the eradication of the American experiment in favor of the proven failures of socialism. And so as you listen to our speakers tonight, ask yourself, can a republic governed by free people survive if its citizens are constantly told by its politicians, its corporate leaders, and its educators that they should live in a constant state of fear and hatred? I think as you listen to our speakers, the answer will be clear. So with that, I'm going to jump to our first speaker, Mike Gonzalez. Mike Gonzalez is the Angeles T. Arando. I did it wrong, didn't I? That was good enough? Good enough. E Pluribus Unum Senior Fellow at the Heritage Foundation, and he writes on critical race theory, identity politics, diversity, multiculturalism, assimilation, and nationalism, as well as foreign policy in general. He spent close to 20 years as a journalist, and we forgive him for each of those years. 15 of them reporting from Europe, Asia, and Latin America. He left journalism to join the administration of President George W. Bush, where he was speechwriter for the Securities and Exchange Commission Chairman Christopher Cox before moving to the State Department's European Bureau. Gonzalez, who joined Heritage in March of 2009, became a senior fellow in June of 2014 and chaired fellow in 2019. He's a widely experienced writer and an experienced public speaker. He has written for dozens of organizations across the country. Gonzalez has appeared on Fox, NBC, and many more stations in the United States, Europe, Asia, and Latin America. And we welcome him here tonight. Mike.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Kevin. It's great. I've been crisscrossing the country. I was in Chicago and Dallas a couple of weeks ago. I'm going to be in Omaha tomorrow. It's great to come to Madison, the belly of the beast. As you will hear from my conversation, Madison has played a key role in critical race theory. Some of you are nodding your heads, so you do know this history. I will give you history today, history of ideas, and I will do so in the hope that this will make you better at what you do. I want to thank you for caring about critical race theory. Yes, the gas lights are flickering. Do not listen to them when they say they're not flickering. They're lying to you. You're right. You're in the line of fire. You're trying to stop this country from being changed, transformed completely. And I want to thank you for that. So because I want to start with history, why don't we go to the first slide? I'm sorry I will not be able to work this. Go ahead, the next one. It all starts here, actually, in Germany. Critical race theory is all about race, but it starts with this group of very white Germans in Thuringia in 1923 who are gathered for what they call the Marxist work week. Communists in Europe were very concerned in the early 20s that the workers were not rising, the proletariat were not rising and overthrowing the capitalist class as Marx and Engels had promised. It had only happened in one backwater place, Russia. It happened in Hungary for about 300 days, but the German Revolution failed in 1919. It failed in Italy, and they get together to discuss what to do. I just want to point out a couple of people there. That gentleman there, George Lukács, don't go. George Lukács was the culture commissar in the Hungarian Soviet. His bright idea was that by introducing sexual depravity to school children, K through 12, he could destroy the family and destroy the nation state. And so they taught not sex ed, but the real sexual depravity. And then the other gentleman here is Felix Wehl, a very wealthy German who then goes on to found the Frankfurt School, the School for Social Research, the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt University, where they explore what to do. They come to the conclusion that the reason why there are no revolutions is because the worker has bought into the cultural givens of the oppressor. He's bought into the superstructure. He has accepted God, the family. He has accepted the capitalist system and the nation state. So the worker has become his own oppressor, and they figure out. They start to wonder, what can we do about this? How do we destroy this? Next slide, please. Critical theory itself is a result of this. It was an essay in 1937 by the third director of the Institute, Max Horkheimer. He does think, the roots of this with Marx, Sigmund Freud. Him and his assistant, Herbert Marcuse, say, well, yeah, the worker has completely bought into the superstructure. Capitalism has suckered them into it. Next slide. Unfortunately, we cannot play this tape. This is Horkheimer right before he dies in 1969, admitting, this is very good, you can find it online. He's speaking German, but there are subtitles in which he's saying, no, we need less freedom. If we're going to have the justice that we want, we need less freedom because capitalism is too good. Capitalism produces the goods, produces material comfort, and the worker will never rise. if we have, so we need to have less freedom to suppress this. He says that. I was going to show it to you. Next slide, please. So it believes that the individuals have created the superstructure that enslaves them. It urges a transformation of society by undermining all of the institutions, all the traditions, applying a barrage of criticism to them. Let me see, I can't see very well. But what they try to do is try to make, they say, if we let the workers and the people understand this evil superstructure, how evil the church is, and how evil the family is, and how evil the nation state is, they will liberate themselves. Marcuse's famous phrase is, all liberation depends on the consciousness of servitude. You, good people of America, do not think of yourselves as serfs or slaves. You think of yourselves as living in the freest country in the world. They say you're wrong. You are ignoring the oppressive superstructure that keeps you down, and their job is to make you aware of it. Next. I really feel bad because you're not be able to see this. This is from the movie The Matrix, which explains critical theory really well, because it is the same thing as The Matrix. Here, Morpheus, by the way, this dates me, it's like a 1992 cult classic, I forget, but Morpheus is explaining to Neo, it's everywhere. You know, everywhere you see, it's in the church, it's everything. Next slide. And this is this is a great, it's too bad you can't see this, in which Morpheus, again, is telling Neo, look at the people around you. Look at the cops. Look at the engineers. Look at the lawyers. They don't know they need to be liberated. They're not our allies. Our job is to make them understand that they need to be liberated. And it was in The Matrix. I was watching it at 3 a.m. My family was on at the coast with my children. My wife was with my children, so I'm watching The Matrix. I'm like stopping every 5 minutes. Like, oh my God, this is critical theory. Next slide. Eventually, the Frankfurt School has to leave for Teachers College because to escape Adolf Hitler. Columbia University offers them a perch. They come to the United States. They become very influential. They hate the American worker and the American just as much as they hated the European worker. We took them in. We gave them a safe passage. And they say the American worker is just completely suckered by his Wi-Fi and his movies and victim mature and his no good culture. And so they begin to criticize American traditions and American culture and American institutions. Next slide. They become, so when we liberate Germany, they all go back to Germany, leaving the hellhole that America is. Horkheimer and Adorno and all the rest. One of them stays behind, Herbert Marcuse, who's Horkheimer's assistant. He becomes very influential with the New Left. The New Left was a bunch of radicals in the 60s that actually agreed with critical theory, and they believed that economics was not going to get the worker to do anything. They all begin to look for a substitute proletariat who's going to lead this revolution to overthrow the system, the American system. Next slide. And Marcuse is watching the riots on TV. By the way, Marcuse was a very awful man himself. He thought that his first book, well, not his first book, but one of his main books was on sex. Again, they're all sex crazed. They say, have orgies, destroy the family, liberate yourself libidinally. Because he understood, again, that sex is such a strong urge that you would destroy the family. But he then realized, sees the race riots, and he says, aha, I got my replacement for the proletariat. Next slide. This is what he says. It is the population of the ghetto that is going to lead this revolt. He says this many, many times. It's not just one phrase. Hold this thought because we're going to jump into something else right now. Next slide, please. We're going to go into critical legal theory. Next slide. This new left, all of this ferment, goes into the law schools. The lawyers begin to say, it's all true, there is a superstructure, it is oppressive, but it is, and these are Marxist lawyers and law students, but it is because it is written into the law as such. The law itself has been written by the oppressor class, by the rich, by the powerful, in order to keep their own power, their own wealth, and they begin to hold conferences every year to discuss these things. You see some of the things they say here. Next slide, please. I'm going to skip. This is a larger presentation. I'm going to skip to the next 2 slides. Suffice it to say, there are many people at the time. I think one of the best was the dean of Duke University Law School, Paul Carrington, who sees the danger in this. The law It doesn't need just cops, and thank you for what you do, but the law needs all of us to obey the law. We need to have deference to the law. And they begin to say critical legal theory is going to destroy deference to the law, because if we begin to believe that the law is just a ruse to perpetuate the ruling class, then it's going to destroy society from within. Courtney, why don't we skip this slide as well? Okay, stay here. So again, the critical legal theorists were New Era guys. Madison appears. This is where they found critical legal theory in 1977 here at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. They have their foundational meeting here, and these people are all the leaders of it. Duncan Kennedy, who writes how influenced he is by Horkheimer, and they're all very upfront about the fact that they're influenced by critical theory. Thus, they name their discipline critical legal theory, critical legal studies. It's not a coincidence, but they write that they're influenced by Horkheimer. They're also influenced by the postmodernists, but I don't want to go into that because that's a tangent. The postmodernists were just as bad, believe me. Next slide. So they see the law school as the place to do opposition to Reagan's America. They see the law school as a place to recruit, to organize, to really mount a Marxist revolution that's going to be long-lasting against what Reagan is doing to America, which they think is awful. One thing that begins to happen is that some of these critical legal scholars were black and also of Mexican descent and Asian. They're attending the conferences. They agree on everything with critical legal theory, almost everything. Go ahead, next slide, please, Courtney. Go ahead. But as they begin to have deep disagreements with their white colleagues, they begin to say, yeah, no, the oppressive class has written these laws and to perpetuate their power and to protect their wealth, but they have something else in common. They're all white. And you're not seeing this because you're white. And they begin to have real big debates at these conferences. They go city to city. Go ahead, next one, please. This is where they agree. The law is a product of a superstructure that is self-serving. The law can never be objective nor neutral, and the equal application of the law is going to produce bad results. Where they disagree, though, is on the issue of race. And there, the disagreements are deep. Go ahead, keep going. Thank you. You can skip this slide, please. And then, these critical legal theorists decide to break off, to take their ball home. So they hold a conference in Madison, at a convent, and it's the foundational conference of critical race theory. It is organized by Kimberly Crenshaw. It is attended by Neil Gotanda and all these other critical legal studies professors who were not white. Go ahead. This is another great video in which Kimberly Crenshaw admits, yeah, I just came up with that term. You know, this is the first time we used the term critical race theory, but it was pulled out of my you-know-what. The writing has been taking place for decades. Derek Bell at Harvard has been writing about the subject of race. Richard Delgado at Alabama has been writing about it, but it doesn't get named until '89. You know the stuff, because you're nodding. Go ahead, the next one. So actually, this is what she says. I was going to skip this one, but it's good if you read it. That's what she says in the video. I just made up this term. Let me give you a chance to read it. Go ahead, next. And then they begin to do something else. They begin to try to evict the white critical legal theorists from civil rights, the civil rights field. They say you don't have the lived experience to write about this or to talk about this. You can take your talents elsewhere. And sometimes it is said quite forcefully. You know, Richard Delgado writes an essay in which he says, you're very talented people. You should abandon civil rights. And if you don't, it's just going to be imperialism and white supremacy. So the critical legal theory, the critical race theory overtakes the field eventually. Through sit-ins, through protests, they put pressure on the universities to hire not just black law professors, but black law professors who agree with them. For example, they write very mean things about Clarence Thomas when he's appointed by Bush. Clarence Thomas is black. If all they cared about was the hiring of blacks, they would have welcomed Clarence Thomas. No, they hate Clarence Thomas. They write caustically about him. What they want is black or non-white law professors who also are neo-Marxist, who agree with them, who hate capitalism. And they succeed. Go ahead, keep going. Go ahead, you keep going for the next one. And this is a good essay. They actually do succeed to take over. They become dominant in the field of civil rights. However, they remain limited to the university. So in the 90s, through these sit-ins, they make the university hire more professors. Go ahead, keep going. This is Derek Bell. The godfather, the recognized godfather of critical race theory. He writes about this from the 1970s on. Then he finally gets a name in '89 in Madison, critical race theory. But he holds these protests at different universities trying to get people who agree with him. The mean one is the one at Harvard in 1990, when he pretty much just walks away from Harvard because they won't hire a black professor who's a critical race theory. And this slide, this is the last video that you're not going to see. Keep going. Because guess who introduces Derek Bell at the 1990 protest? A young, wiry law student. And if you're a conspiracy theorist, your head is exploding right now. And I don't think that it's a conspiracy. I think that it's a wonderful coincidence that this young man who does go on to become our 44th president has all these nice things to say about Derek Bell as he introduces him at this very key protest as they begin to take over the law schools. It breaks my heart, but I want to show it in Omaha. Okay, next slide. So again, this is what they do. This is their main. As Vivek and all of us will know, we read these people all the time. I have bottles of Excedrin littering my study because I read Derek Bell, Richard Delgado, Kimberly Crenshaw, Angela Harris, Patricia Williams. All the stuff they do in your schools and in your places of work have to do because of the writing. It is all CRT. Don't let them gaslight you. Next, please. And it begins to finally break out of the university. Richard Carranza, the superintendent of New York Public Schools, begins to introduce it in the New York Public School System. That's the largest school system in the country, by the way. I think it's 1 million kids. I begin to write about it in 2017 when Carranza is using it. But then last year, it explodes. It just explodes. It explodes for reasons that you don't understand. George Floyd and Black Lives Matter. We have riots and demonstrations and lootings. And the leaders of your elite institutions surrender. They surrender. They say, we are a systemically racist country. We have to change this. This is a racial reckoning. And all of the tenets of CRT now enter police departments and the military and the houses of worship and the schools. And it's wrecking our lives, and it's going to wreck our country unless we do something about it. But it is because of the year that we had last year. And you all know this. Keep the rock. So I just want to add this slide because, to me, the main problem with critical theory is that it sows distrust in the institutions, right? The main problem with critical legal theory is that it sows distrust in the law. The next slide. My main problem with critical race theory, it's not that it tells white kids are racist. That's awful. That's awful, by the way, the fact that you're being told you're racist. No, it's what it does to the black family, is that it justifies crime. It tries to decriminalize crime. These are the writings of the architects. It tries to justify dysfunction instead of making people live up to better practices, to better habits, to better ideas, to close the disparities this way. It tries to lower standards across the board, and that is, I find, just absolutely disgusting. Keep going, please. Next. It teaches that the oppressor-oppressed narrative that you have been hearing about for the last 17 minutes. It teaches black kids you're never going to amount to anything because of white supremacy, and even you cannot succeed individually. Success will get you nothing. You need to destroy the system by acting collectively. Next. And this is what Derek Bell himself writes. The godfather of critical race theory introduced so fulsomely by our 44th president in 1990. He writes this, and he writes this in many different ways. This is not just one quote. Next. Again, keep going, please. Keep going, please. Another thing that's going to make you, if you're conspiracy-minded, we were talking about this, James and I, before. Herbert Marcuse, the critical theorist who stayed behind and did so many bad things, his star pupil was Angela Davis, the Black Panther who went to prison in the early 70s, a communist, an unrepentant communist, was given the Lenin Peace Prize by Erich Honecker. That's the most oppressive East German regime among the Soviet satellites. She today goes to universities, she goes to UVA, she stands up with a fist in the air and says, I am a communist, I've always been a communist, and students who don't know anything stand up and give her a rousing cheer. And guess whose intellectual mentor she is? The founders of Black Lives Matter. There she is with Patrisse Cullors, one of the founders and leaders of Black Lives Matter, the executive director of the main Black Lives Matter group, BLM GNF, Global Network Foundation. She's also very influential with Alicia Garza. Goes from Marcuse to BLM. Next. This is just the retail purveyors of critical race theory. I never write about them, even though they are CRT. Next, I just go very quickly, because you're being lied to. How do you recognize it? Anything that uses systemic racism, that uses any of this lingo, it is critical race theory. You can tell your teacher, your school superintendent, stop lying to me. This is critical race theory. Next. Anything that says, no, America doesn't have a culture, is just a front for white culture, and actually being punctual and loving to read and write and loving literacy, it's just white stuff. It's false, it's disgusting, it's racist. We need to get rid of it, and it is critical race theory. Next. Anything that argues that people are born with a privilege just because they're white, and that has prevented them from uniting with blacks to overthrow capitalism because they get these wages of whiteness. That is critical race theory. That's an offshoot of critical race theory called whiteness studies. For our purposes, it is critical race theory. It's being taught in our schools. Next. And it's being taught in our places of work. The fourth one is this idea that the system is rigged, so there is no meritocracy. Meritocracy is a myth, something that CRT writers write about often, that all of the measures of success, all of the criteria cannot be used. You cannot use SATs, you cannot use tests, because this is all measuring the wrong thing. No. It's critical race theory and it's bad. And the last one is that equity has to replace equality. Equity is a fine word. They've corrupted it to mean unequal treatment by government. That is illegal in our system of government. We have one constitution, the Constitution of '87, and we have the Civil Rights Act, which we need to uphold. We cannot have the government treating people unequally because of their race. This is a gigantic step backward. And then the last slide is a shameless plug for my book. But the book that's coming out September 7th is my next book that is going to get me into a lot of trouble. BLM, The New Marxist Revolution. I only have this copy, but it comes out September 7th. You can pre-order it right now. You're a wonderful audience. It's great to speak to you here in Madison, and thank you for coming out and caring about this issue. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mike. It's warm in here. Is everybody feeling that? All right, I think they got the AC pumped up. We'll urge them to keep pumping it up as far as it'll go. But it is hot, as you all know. I think it was like 90 degrees when I pulled in here tonight. So first, before we move on to our next speaker, I would like to ask all of our local school board members and state legislators to please stand up if you're in the audience here tonight. If you could, please stand up. Thank you. Thanks so much for coming. And I'll just say, a number of them joined us beforehand at a smaller group meeting that we did right beforehand so they could ask some questions of our speakers. And just know that is part of what we're doing, No Better Friend, is trying to connect those that are on the leading edges of pushing back on critical race theory with elected officials throughout the state of Wisconsin, such that they can then take the fight directly to our state and also to localities. So with that, I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Vivek Ramaswamy. Vivek is a successful entrepreneur who has founded multiple successful enterprises. A first-generation American, he is the founder and executive chairman of Roivant Sciences. Did I pronounce it correctly? Did I? Okay. a new type of biopharmaceutical company focused on the application of technology to drug development. He founded the company in 2014 and led one of the largest biotech IPOs of 2015 and 16, eventually culminating in successful clinical trials in multiple disease areas that led to FDA-approved products. Mr. Ramaswamy was born and raised in Southwest Ohio. He graduated summa cum laude in biology from Harvard in 2007 and began his career as a successful biotech investor at a prominent hedge fund. He has continued to work as an investor while earning his law degree at Yale, where he was a recipient of the Paul and Daisy Soros Fellowship for New Americans. He has been featured on the cover of Forbes magazine in 2015 for his work in drug development. In 2020, he emerged as a prominent national commentator on stakeholder capitalism, free speech, and woke culture. He has authored numerous articles and op-eds which have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, National Review, Newsweek, Harvard, and the Harvard Business Review. And he serves on the board of directors of the Philanthropy Roundtable and the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity. He's also a new author of Woke Incorporated. This is his last stop before he kicks off a book tour, and he will be donating the proceeds from that book to continuing the fight against critical race theory. Vivek, come on up.
So thank you for having me. I'm from Ohio. I'm not a Wisconsin native, but it is a pleasure to be here. As you heard in the introduction, I actually was a kid of immigrants. So my dad came to this country. Thank you. A couple of you in the audience. Thank you. My dad came to the country from India. He came in the late 1970s. He didn't come here with very much money. But we always had a question for him as a kid, which was, why would you come halfway across the world to Ohio? And his response to that was that, actually, he needed to be near his older sister who had come before him to Fort Wayne, Indiana. And that always raised the question for me of why she came halfway across the world from India to Fort Wayne, Indiana. And the joke we tell in the family is it's the only U.S. state with the word India contained in the name of the state. So that's the joke we tell. But we're still here in the Midwest, and we flew over Indiana to come here from Ohio. So that's where we are. I'm going to start by telling you about my childhood, actually, that takes me back to 1993, when I was in second grade. And that was when I heard Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech for the first time. That was the speech where he said that I hope my 4 children grow up in a country where they will be judged not on the color of their skin, but of their character. Now let me just take a minute to interrupt myself. I'm using the microphone, the handheld microphone. If it's gonna, yeah, I'm gonna. Is it all right if I just switch to that? Thank you. I got here late for the sound test, so that was my fault, actually. But I was telling you about Martin Luther King's dream. And that was the speech where it stuck with me all these years, where he just said, I hope my 4 children, and it was about his children, mind you, his 4 children grow up in a country where they would be judged not on the color of their skin, but on the content of their character. And the reason that dream stuck with me, the reason it meant something to me, is that it was actually the dream that allowed my dad to come to this country 40 years ago and build a successful career at the GE plant in Evendale, Ohio, despite the fact that he had, and still has to this day, a thick Indian accent. It was the dream that allowed me to go in a single generation from being the kid of Indian immigrants who came to this country with almost no money to becoming, as you heard, the founder of a multi-billion-dollar biotech company that got drugs to patients who needed them. And the drug that I'm most personally proud of, actually, that I worked on during my time as CEO, is a new drug that's FDA approved today for the treatment of prostate cancer. Thank you. Thank you. But I stepped down from my role as CEO earlier this year to work on a different kind of cancer. A cancer that threatened the very dream that Martin Luther King taught 60 years ago, a dream that threatened to kill the American dream that allowed me to achieve everything I ever have in my life. You call it critical race theory, I call it the woke agenda. But this new disease is a secular religion in our country that centers on the idea that your identity is based on your race, your gender, and your sexual orientation, full stop. It says that America is a systemically racist country. That if you're black, you're inherently disadvantaged. That if you're white, you're inherently privileged. No matter your economic upbringing, no matter your economic background, your race and your gender govern who you are and what you're allowed to think. You are a prisoner of the color of your skin. And you don't have to just take it from me. We were talking about gaslighting before. Don't believe me. Just take it from the high priests of this new religion. Take it from Ibram Kendi, who we skipped quickly past on that last slide, who said that the only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. Or take it from another one of the high priests of this new religion, Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, a member of the Squad in Congress, who famously said a year and a half ago that we don't want any more black faces that don't want to be black voices. Think of Tim Scott. We don't want any more brown faces that don't want to be brown voices. I'm going to guess I don't fit her description of what counts as a brown voice. But there's a really clever part about how this particular virus spreads. And it's this. If you disagree with any of those claims, that actually means that you're a racist and you don't know it. Because when race is not just about your skin color, but about your voice, then disagreement with that voice makes you a racist. If you say that I'm not racist, today that actually means you are racist. If you say that all lives matter, somehow that came to mean that you believe that black lives don't matter. If you capitalize the W in white, or you fail to capitalize the B in black, you're also a racist as of last year. And there is no greater damnation in modern America than to be called a racist. So when given the choice between being tarred with the scarlet R or pledging allegiance to this new religion, everyday Americans are choosing to bend the knee. And that has created a new culture of fear in our country. Fear of losing your job. Fear of your kid getting a bad grade in school. Fear of becoming a pariah in your own community. And to me, that is a betrayal of what American democracy is all about, because that culture of fear has completely eviscerated our culture of free speech in this country. A good measure for the health of any democracy, especially American democracy, is really simple if you ask me. It is the percentage of people who feel free to say what they actually believe in public. And right now, we are doing abysmally on that metric. According to a recent survey conducted by the Cato Institute, over 60%, I want you to process that number for a second, 60% of Americans say they are afraid of expressing their true beliefs because of the current political climate. That is not America. That is not the country that my parents came halfway across the world to join. That is not the country I want to see America become. We have a new red guard in this country who, instead of pushing the Chinese philosophy of Chinese-style Marxism, is today pushing this new philosophy of wokeism. And it is in the name of diversity that we have now sacrificed true diversity of thought. It is in the name of democracy that we have now sacrificed our most important democratic ideals of free speech and open debate. It is in the name of inclusion that we have created this new exclusionary culture where certain points of view are just not welcome. Now, you heard in the last talk, and it was a really good talk, I learned a lot from it, thank you for that. You heard about how critical theory and wokeism was born as a way of challenging the system, of standing up to the system. And agree or not, and I think we're both on the same side of that, agree or not, there's something about that that I can actually respect. But today, wokeism isn't about challenging the system. Wokeism is the system. And the story of how we got here is part of what I write about in my book. It's an untold story that actually traces back to an unlikely place, the 2008 financial crisis. Remember that? After the '08 financial crisis, corporations were the bad guys. And what the old left wanted to do, agree or not, what they wanted to do was to take money from those wealthy corporate fat cats and redistribute it to poor people to help poor people. But there was a new woke left that was born right around the same time, right around that time that wiry young guy became president of the United States in 2008. What the new woke left wanted to do was to say that actually the real problem it wasn't quite economic injustice. No. It wasn't quite poverty. No. It was racial injustice and misogyny and bigotry. And guess what? That actually presented the opportunity of a generation for big business and Wall Street. Because you see, if you're big business or you're Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street, that's actually a pretty tough pill to swallow. But this new woke stuff was actually pretty easy. Applaud diversity and inclusion. Put some token minorities on your boards. Muse about the racially disparate impact of climate change after you fly on a private jet to a fancy ski town called Davos. This is actually a pretty good game if you can play it pretty well. Big banks were happy to lend not just their money, but their legitimacy to this new woke movement. They were happy to use not just their market power in the market, but their market power in the marketplace of ideas, but they didn't do it for free. They had an ask in return. The ask in return was to the new left, work with the left-wing power in the Democratic Party to leave our corporate power intact. And it has actually worked masterfully for both sides. So what you had happen over the last 10 years was a bunch of big banks and big businesses that got in bed with a bunch of woke millennials. Together they birthed woke capitalism, and they put Occupy Wall Street up for adoption. That's how that game was played. And it worked so well that their friends on the other coast in Silicon Valley, they like to call this flyover country. I like to tell them, keep flying. Okay. They actually observed the exact same phenomenon in the other direction, which is to say that, dang, that worked pretty well for Wall Street. Let's get in on the action. So they said, okay, we're going to censor any content that the woke left doesn't want to see online. But again, we don't do it for free. We expect the new Democratic Party to look the other way when it comes to leaving our monopoly power intact. And again, it has worked masterfully for both sides. That is how this game is played. It is not an arranged marriage of love. It is more like mutual prostitution, and the net result is the illegitimate birth of what I call the woke industrial complex, a force that is the most powerful monster I believe we have seen in modern American history. And now it is not just Silicon Valley. It is not just Wall Street. It is corporate America as we know it. It is Coca-Cola teaching its employees on how to be less white and issuing statements about a new voting law in Georgia that make it sound more like a super PAC than a soft drink manufacturer. It is United Airlines. I flew here in the middle of a storm today. I'm going to tell you, this didn't make me feel very good when United Airlines say they are going to get rid of their tests for pilot competence to make sure that 50% of pilots are persons of color or women in the cockpit. It is Nike telling you that they donate tens of millions of dollars to Black Lives Matter, a Marxist organization that professes to care about black lives, all the while sourcing $250 sneakers using slave labor in Asia to sell those $250 sneakers to black kids in the inner city who can't afford to buy books for school. That is how this game is played. It is a new force that is not just big government alone, but a hybrid of big government and big business that is more powerful than either one alone because it can do what each cannot on its own. And I have some bad news for you. It gets even worse in the last few years when there's a new actor who showed up on the scene and turned this unholy alliance into a three-party affair. And that new force is the Communist Party of China. And I can tell you, from personal experience, they understand this game far more deeply than any of us do. There is even a new Chinese word for wokeness, baizuo. It literally refers to woke white people in the United States, and they use it to laugh at us. And even worse, they're now using it to undermine our geopolitical position on the global stage. And if you have any doubt about that, just listen really closely to what they are now saying in nearly every diplomatic forum. Last year, EU officials press Xi Jinping, the head of China, about Uyghur human rights violations in the Xinjiang province, where, by the way, they have locked up over 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camps in what I think is one of the worst human rights atrocities committed by a major nation since the Third Reich in Germany in the 1930s. And the first thing that Xi Jinping says is that Black Lives Matter shows that the United States is no better. It wasn't an accident, because earlier this year, Yang Jiechi's top diplomat came here to the Alaska summit and lectured us in his first 15 minutes of his opening statement, saying that China hopes that the United States stops slaughtering, that is his word, slaughtering black Americans, and that China hopes the United States does better on human rights. Now, that would be laughable if it weren't for the fact that they're able to get away with it. And how are they able to get away with it? It actually, in my opinion, comes down to those woke corporations, because the new international arbiters of moral justice, the people who are always known to criticize injustice, don't criticize the CCP. Actually, they praise them. So if you take Disney, 2 years ago, they said they could not film in the state of Georgia if they passed a new anti-abortion statute, the equivalent of a heartbeat bill. But just last year, Disney goes to the Xinjiang province of China, literally ground zero of the Uyghur human rights crisis, to film Mulan. They do not say a peep until the very end, where they finally summon the courage to speak up in the credits to the film, where they say, "We thank the local authorities in the Xinjiang province of China, the very CCP authorities that are committing those same human rights atrocities." That's Disney. The NBA is even worse. They regularly criticize social injustice and racism in the United States. They paint Black Lives Matter on their courts, but they do not say a peep as they continue to expand into the Chinese market. And from my home state, take LeBron James, a frequent critic of racial injustice in the United States. He was actually the first person who came to China's public defense when Daryl Morey of the Houston Rockets tweeted, "Fight for freedom, stand with Hong Kong." He was denounced, the Rockets considered firing him, and LeBron James came to China's public defense. That is how this game is played. Now, why do these companies and their crony celebrities do it? The answer is really simple. You said it. It comes down to money. It is when wokeness got mixed with capitalism, got supercharged with the muscle of corporate power, that it actually became unstoppable. Because they build a great Chinese wall to prevent you from entering the Chinese market if you criticize the CCP. But here's the secret part. They roll out the red carpet if you criticize the United States. They are playing us like a Chinese mandolin. It is working, and now they are using the same tactic to deflect accountability for the origin of this virus, the COVID-19 pandemic. Where if you say the Marburg virus, which came from Germany, totally fine. You could say the West Nile virus, which came from the river where it originated. You could say the Zika virus, named after the forest where it came from. You could say the Japanese encephalitis virus, which, as you might have guessed, came from Japan. Or even with COVID-19, you could say the UK strain. You could say the Brazilian strain. You could say the South African strain. You could say the Indian double mutant strain. But if you say the Wuhan virus, you are immediately bashed as a racist and a bigot. And you have to ask yourself, why? I think it's because the CCP has weaponized not just the COVID-19 pandemic, but the woke pandemic to equate Chinese nihilism with American idealism. And when that happens, nihilism wins every time. Thank you, LeBron James. So who wins this game? Corporations win. Woke activists win. The Chinese Communist Party wins. But the real losers are the American people and American democracy itself. Now that's the problem. What I want to do is I want to shift to talking about the solutions. And I'm going to start talking about the solutions by resetting our frame of mind just a little bit. One of my heroes, Ronald Reagan, in 1980, came to power and did what he needed to do in his era, which was to deregulate and to cut taxes and to herald in a revolution whose echoes we continue to hear and whose fruits we continue to enjoy today, to this day, 40 years later. That's why he's one of my heroes. But my top Republican hero actually came before Ronald Reagan, came 160 years ago, in Abraham Lincoln, who in 1860 famously said, "The dogmas of a quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present." And I think that the dogmas of 1980 are inadequate to address the unique challenges of 2021. Let's take the issue of big tech censorship for a second. That's what prevents us from being able to openly discuss the kinds of issues we're discussing here today online. Now, what they say is that these are private companies, and they're free to decide what does and doesn't show up on their websites. And there's a certain truth to that if they're actually operating as private companies. But here's the new trick. They're actually acting as agents of the state, responding to threats from the party in power, saying that if you don't take down hate speech or misinformation as we define it, we're going to come after you, we're going to regulate you, we're going to break you up. Oh, and by the way, here's this piece of candy called Section 230 that immunizes you from any liability if you go out and remove and censor the very speech that we, the government in power, want you to remove. That is not the action of a private company. It is doing through the back door, using private companies as deputized agents to do through the back door what the government cannot directly do under the Constitution. And if it is state action in disguise, the Constitution still applies. That's a 2021 solution, not a 1980 solution. It's the kind of solution we need to wake up to today. Thank you. Now, the same companies then go back and fire their employees who defect from that orthodoxy. Take a look at what Google did to James Damore in 2017 and the trend that has since followed in Silicon Valley. Well, I say that if you can't discriminate against somebody on the basis of their race or their sex or their religion or their national origin or, as of last year, their sexual orientation, then you should not be able to discriminate against them just because they're an outspoken conservative either. We need to add political belief as a protected class right up there next to race, sex, and religion in Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now I have to confess, I didn't always think this way. I used to consider myself a libertarian, and I used to say that, hey, look, the free market should work these things out. The last thing we should want to do is impose constraints on private actors. One more constraint on a private business isn't what we need. The market should work this out. And if these silly businesses over there are firing all these great conservatives, that's a great opportunity for a different business to hire all those conservatives instead. It's a reasonable line of argument. But here's my problem with that line of thinking. We have to apply the standards evenly. And if we want to have a conversation about eliminating protected classes, including race and sex and religion and sexual orientation, fine. I'm open for business to have that conversation. Nobody else seems to be, but on the right, the left, the center, or the Libertarian Party, but I'm open. But if we're not going to have that conversation, then you got to apply the standard evenly. And if you can't discriminate against somebody for being black or brown or gay or Muslim or Jewish or Christian or whatever, you should not be able to discriminate against them just because they're an outspoken conservative. If you cannot deplatform somebody because they're black or gay or Muslim or Christian or Jewish or whatever, you should not be able to deplatform them just because they're an outspoken conservative. And this is not an academic issue. It is happening every day in this country. If it can happen to the 45th President of the United States, it can happen to anybody. So I talk about more of these legal solutions in my book. But I think the real solutions are fundamentally cultural in nature. Now, I spent a lot of my time, I was educated at places like Harvard and Yale. I've been in the elite New York finance world, a venture-backed company, $1 billion plus in whatever market value, et cetera. I've been in elite circles, okay? And I am unafraid about talking to audiences about things that they may not want to hear. Well, I'm going to take the liberty of doing a little bit of that tonight. I'm going to challenge some suppositions of the anti-critical race theory movement, and you don't have to agree with me, but I will ask you to listen to me. The first thing I'd ask you to consider is whether we should actually stop calling it critical race theory in the first place. The way I look at it is, if you're teaching a kid to be oppressed or an oppressor based on the color of their skin, and you're getting gaslit on the other side with somebody telling you that's not critical race theory, we heard a great lecture teaching you that it is. Okay. But my view is, I don't care what you call it. I don't want you doing it to our next generation of young Americans. The second thing I'd ask you to do, I'd ask all of us to do, I'd ask myself to do better than I've done in this respect too, is to talk less about what we don't want to be teaching in our schools and to talk more about what we do want to be teaching in our schools. Let's talk about the history that made this country great. Let's not just talk about all of the ways we fell short of our ideals such that we cause our kids to forget what those ideals even were. Let's talk about those ideals first, and then maybe when we get to 11th and 12th grade, we can talk a little bit about how we fell short of them too, because it's important to have that holistic picture. But let's actually talk about the ideals that made this country great rather than pretending that our country was born in an absence of idealism in the first place. That's something where we need to be doing better too. Thank you. Well, I got more agreement than I expected on those first two, so I'm really going to test you with a third one here. The third one is that I think we need to be really careful when it comes to the discussion about banning any ideology in our schools, including critical race theory, as reluctant as it is for me to say that. I think that one of the ways I worry about us losing this culture war is not with a bang, as T.S. Eliot might have said, but with a whimper, where we accidentally end up joining the church that we oppose by joining that church under a different name. It reminds me of the war on terror in the wake of what happened in 2001. I remember I was in high school in U.S. history class when those two planes hit the World Trade Center and hit the Pentagon on that day. It's etched into my mind. I didn't just observe the news that day. I learned U.S. history while I was in U.S. history class. And I remember the war on terror that followed, how difficult it was to fight terrorists who were willing to adopt methods that we would never adopt in return, striking innocent civilians. Yes, that's easier to do in the short run. But if we do it, we just join their ranks under a different name and have lost fighting for what we ultimately wish to fight for. And I think that the essence of cancel culture today is the use of force to supplant free speech and open debate as our mechanism for settling political questions. And I think we owe it to ourselves and to our movement to remember that is actually the value that we stand for. And we ought to focus on a revival of civic education and what we do want to be teaching in our schools, rather than resorting to the methods of the other side. Or else we lose the culture war by getting infected by the other side without ever recognizing that we lost. And not all of you have to agree with that, but I will ask you to think about it. In closing, the thing I will say, and this is where I'll wrap up, is that the thing that we really need in our country is a cultural cure and a revival of those shared ideals that define us as Americans. Because it is true that our schools are teaching our kids to be ashamed of our history rather than to be proud of it. Patriotism is on the decline. Faith has nearly disappeared. I don't even think we have a good answer to what it means to be an American in the year 2021. I can't remember a time in my life where we more badly needed an answer to that question. Our absence of an answer to that question is the black hole at the center of our nation's soul. And when you have a vacuum that runs that deep, that is when these toxic ideologies begin to fill that void. That is when wokeism becomes opium for the American soul. If the last decade was our decade of celebrating our diversity and our differences, then fine, let it be. It's in the past. Let the next decade be about celebrating what still binds us together as one people, as Americans. Thank you. Thank you. And the top of the list of those ideals was the dream that I told you about at the very beginning. The American dream, the idea that no matter who you are or who your parents were or where they came from or what your skin color is, you can achieve anything you ever want in this country with your own hard work, your own commitment, and your own dedication. That is the American dream. Thank you. Now, over the last decade, the scary thing that happened is that we woke up from that dream. And when you wake up from a dream, you forget what it was all about. You might remember how it felt for a little while. Pretty soon you forget that too. That is the real danger of wokeness. But I still think we have time to get this right, to revive those shared ideals of e pluribus unum, from many one, the American dream, the ideals that bind us together as one people and as Americans. And the other side, and we all have friends, and we all should have friends on the other side will say that that may be a load of high-minded hogwash because America's history is littered with imperfection, that America is imperfect. And my answer to that is that somewhere deep down in there, you know what, they have a point. America isn't perfect. America has never been perfect. America will never be perfect. And in fact, America was founded on the idea that perfection is impossible on God's green earth. That is why we have a system of checks and balances. But more so than any nation in human history, America is about the pursuit of perfection, the pursuit of a more perfect union, the pursuit of liberty, equality, and justice for all. Those are the values that won the American Revolution. Those are the values that reunited us after the Civil War. Those are the values that won us World War I and World War II and the Cold War. Those are the values that still give hope to the free world. And if we can revive those common values rather than fractious group identity, then nobody in the world, not a nation, not a corporation, not a virus is going to defeat us. That is what true American exceptionalism is all about, and that is what we will need to revive in order to defeat this cultural epidemic. So I thank you for being part of this movement. Thank you for giving me this platform today. Thank you. Thank you. I'll end it there. Thank you.
Well, it's a long way to Richmond. On 95 with a redhead riding shotgun and a pistol by my side, tearing down that highway.
All right.
Like a modern
Are you still fired up? Are you? All right. We got more. We got more. I do want to take a moment, just do it, and feel free to stretch your legs. I'm going to give a couple admin announcements here. One is you'll note on your seats that we distributed basically a CRT handout. As we've done these events, we've had a lot of people come to us and say we need resources on identifying critical race theory, following up, and then continuing the fight. Just know that you can basically scan that QR code. It's going to take you to the No Better Friend Corp website, where you'll actually see a number of the publications and different resources coming from our speakers tonight. So please do check that out and do so. You'll also find more information about No Better Friend and what we're up to. Beyond that, while we're taking a brief pause here, I want to take a moment to identify our team. They're around here. Chris Lawrence, are you out there? All right, he's around there. Carlton Huffman is right back there. Courtney Mullen, Courtney hanging out in back, as well as Daryl Carlson is not here tonight, but he's wrapping up some guard duty obligations. Jessie, my wife, where's she at? Jessie actually testified today. Let's give her a round of applause at the state legislature on legislation demanding transparency in education. So, right to the point. And thank you so much. We've got a number of volunteers out there, including my Uncle Dale and Aunt Sally and many others who are here tonight helping us out. We greatly appreciate it. So, with that, I want to keep the momentum going, and you're not going to want to miss our next speaker. So if you're able to grab your seats again, I'll start my introduction for Adam Coleman, and we'll jump back into it. So Adam Coleman is also an author and the founder of Wrong Speak Publishing. Adam was born in Detroit, but raised in a variety of states throughout the United States of America. He writes openly about his personal struggles with fatherlessness, homelessness, and masculinity. He is always questioning the world around him, even if the questions he asks are uncomfortable. He strongly believes that we should have the ability to speak freely and is now advocating for people who feel voiceless to actually be heard. He's attempting to help change the narrative and the way we discuss cultural narratives by being honest, humble, and resolute. He's also a weekly writing contributor for the publication ScoonTV.com and an occasional public speaker, as he is tonight. Also the author of Black Victim to Black Victor. Adam, come on up.
I was very interested in the culture war and what was going on in the college campuses. And to my surprise, what happened after George Floyd and how the rest of the world started appearing like the college campuses. And I started seeing how the news media was portraying black people in a way that we're all just inherent victims. And I got absolutely sick and tired of everyone speaking for me. I got tired of the narrative that I'm always in danger, that there's nothing I can do about my circumstance, and that all my troubles throughout my life has to do with my skin color. After that, I decided to start writing. I had never written a book, but I wanted to try. And it took me about 9 months. I self-published my book, Black Victim to Black Victor, and I'm absolutely proud of the reaction to it. I told you a little bit about myself. I'm one of those people who believes that you don't know anybody until you know their childhood. So I wanted to read a bit from my book, if you don't mind. My father chose the simplest and laziest option a father could choose in reaction to having a child, to do nothing. I've thought countless times about how I feel about my father, and the one word that constantly comes to mind is weak. He was too weak a man to fight his sexual urges and stay faithful in his marriage. He was too weak a man to not involve himself in our lives for fear of hurting the marriage he betrayed with his infidelity. He was too weak a man to admit his mistakes to his children and apologize for the pain he inflicted by his absence. My father wasn't poor. In fact, he did well for himself as a tailor and a business owner, yet he allowed for his children to go in and out of homelessness while my mother was left to pick up the pieces. The nights sitting in a homeless shelter were never followed by a phone call from my father. Were never followed by a phone call from my father to help financially or give emotional support. We suffered in silence from our father, and the most minimal effort could have changed our trajectory, yet he remained apathetic and absent. The last time I spoke with my father, I was 21 years old, and it was over the phone. My son was born just months earlier, and I was at a pivotal point in my life. I wanted to give one more attempt to have my father in my life and see if he could overcome his weak-minded nature as a father. Our conversation was brief, awkward, and he displayed the same behavior he had my entire life, disinterested. After that phone call, I made the decision that if he would not try, I wouldn't either. I never ignored his phone calls because he would have to attempt to contact me in order for me to ignore them. Ultimately, my weak father chose his role in our family on the day I was born. One day, I received a message from my mother telling me that my father was dead, that he died a few months prior to her message. My late knowledge that my father died exemplifies our relationship and how insignificant we were to him. There was nothing in his will for us because that would take effort and care to do so. What I realized was that his death meant nothing to me because he was dead to me long before his corporeal death. The reason I told you that story is because my story is not uncommon for a lot of black people in America these days. It's unfortunate to say that if you know someone who's black, you can pretty much guess the odds are in your favor that they grew up without their parents in the same home. Whether they're active in their life is a different story, but once you separate the family in that manner, you put the children at a disadvantage. And that was my life. Critical race theory would have done nothing for me as a child. If that garbage was taught to me as a kid, it would have made my life worse, not better. There is no theory, no conversation that can replace my father. There is no paycheck. There is no reparations. There is nothing that the government can do to replace who my father could have been. And that's why I'm here talking about critical race theory, because we're all sold this bill of goods that it is a way to equalize Black Americans to white Americans by just making everybody hyper-focus on race. But I want to go at a different approach. I want to ask a question: why does it appear that half of America believes this? All of a sudden, a year ago, nobody knew what critical race theory was, in the majority. Now everybody knows what it is. And for some people, and unfortunately some of them on school boards, they believe that this ideology that some of them have just become aware of is the way to start racial justice. The way I see it is, critical race theory only works if you believe in the greater conspiracy theory, because it's very conspiratorial. The greater conspiracy theory is that white supremacy is the sole motive for everything that happens in America. And the only way that conspiracy works is if you believe in either one or all four of lies. This is my theory. You can call it critical Coleman theory or whatever you want to call it. But I wanted to go through this. So the reason I say it's conspiratorial is because it's very just that, conspiratorial. They believe that white supremacy is within all of you inherently, and that no matter what you do, you're always perpetuating it. In every conversation, there is race involved, whether you realize it or not. And the way they outline critical race theory is much like a conspiracy theory. If we want to talk about the JFK assassination, you find some way to support your end theory. The end theory for them is that white supremacy is everywhere. It's endemic. We always picture someone who's a conspiracy theorist with something on their wall with strings attached to pictures. And they're given the illusion that they're connecting the dots forward, but all they're doing is finding a path backwards. They already have their end conclusion. That's not how you work out a solution or find a real problem. That's what critical race theory is much like to me. It sounds like a conspiracy theory. So, what are the lies? Lie number one, slavery was only about racial hatred. When you believe that lie, then you completely ignore all the nuances of American history, world history, just human history in general. You absolve the Ashanti tribes, the Ashanti Empire within Africa and West Africa that willingly gathered their neighboring tribes, prisoned them, and sold them off to Europeans. And in some cases, they sold them for guns and other goods. It completely absolves it from that being the existence, because it is only because of the white European that this occurred. Well, what about the Africans? Did they not see race? No, they didn't see race, because it wasn't about race. It was about tribe. It was about money. It was about power. It was everything but race. The Europeans were just another cog in the wheel as far as finding someone to work alongside, and it was a great benefit to them to sell their rivals. Another thing that following that line of thought as far as slavery only being about racial hatred is ignoring that there were other people who were slaves within the United States, or I should say the colonies. In an article titled "Origin of the Idea of Race," is quoted, "In the latter part of the 17th century, the demand for labor grew enormously, and it had become clear that neither Irishmen nor Indians made good slaves. More than that, the real threats to social order were the poor, freed whites who demanded lands and privileges that the upper-class colonial governments refused. Some colonial leaders argue that turning to African labor provided a buffer against the masses of poor whites. This theory, this lie, slavery was only about racial hatred, absolves everything that I just read here. That it was about control. It was about keeping the whites under control. It was about finding the best way to have slavery without dividing these people up and focusing on the rich, the government, and all the elites who were controlling them. Lie number 2, Jim Crow was only about racial hatred. If you believe that, you skip everything else about Jim Crow. Jim Crow was bad for black people, but I argue it was also bad for white Americans too. Anytime you split up a country based on something superficial, it is bad for everybody. It is not good business, except if you're part of one particular class, the elite class. We all know of the KKK. They proclaim themselves to be a Christian organization. Yeah, they're not. But why did the KKK come into existence? The KKK was formed by Confederates that had lost the Civil War. But there was a particular reason why they started going after black people. I want to read a line from an article titled "The Ku Klux Klan and Violence at the Polls." Very short. By 1868, which is, I believe, 1 year after the ending of the Civil War, the Klan had evolved into a hooded terrorist organization responsible for murdering thousands of free blacks and their white Republican allies. I want to read that again. Free blacks and their white Republican allies. So why were they going after white Republicans? Because they knew that this voting bloc was not for the Democrats. It was not for the party that was fighting to keep them enslaved. They wanted social control. They wanted power. There was a reason why, at this heyday of Ku Klux Klan, that Congress was filled with Klansmen, proudly, openly. This was about politics. This was about power. This was about control. And black people were just a way that they can have that social control and keep them at bay, since majority of them lived in the South. Lie number 3, the lack of black representation and racial disparities is a signifier of black oppression. I want to focus in on government, because I think that's been one of the biggest lies that was sold to black Americans, was that your lack of representation within government is why you're not doing well. It's why you're not financially successful. That way of thinking has led for black people to automatically put trust into the government, to get into government, become government officials within certain cities, neighborhoods, whatever. And you can look at the case of Barack Obama, his presidency. Superficially, these are achievements. They sound good, they look nice, but what are the results? The results haven't been in favor of black people. Government representation means nothing if everyone's corrupt. And what happens is they use skin color to control people. I like to say that they ride into black ghettos in their Mercedes-Benz and say the white man's bad as they roll back out of the ghetto and go into their suburbs, and they wave at Officer Dan, who is white, and they're next to their neighbors who are white. They're hypocrites. They know what they're doing, and they do it all the time. The problem is it works. This is about social control. This is about the government and the usage of government and representation within government as being the gaze of black empowerment. It's not. But believing that lie, believing that blacks need to get into government on a consistent basis, now that they're all Democrats, is about social control. Lie number 4, and this might sound controversial, but I'll explain it. Lie number 4, there were no downsides to the civil rights movement. What I mean by that is, obviously, segregation is wrong, it's immoral. Jim Crow is wrong, it's immoral. The usage of separating people is wrong and immoral. But ignoring that there were downsides to the civil rights movement has been our detriment. When we see a Black empowerment movement, when we see people saying, I'm standing up for the rights of Black people, we automatically take them for their word, and they gain power. So now we are to associate BLM with the 1960 civil rights movement. But it takes a while for us to realize that this is BS that we're being sold. These people aren't representations of the greatness of someone like Martin Luther King. But because we believe that lie, they gain power, and before we know it, they have too much power and too much control, too much say. Like they stated, like our previous speaker stated, their philosophy gets into companies, their philosophy gets into government, and they are associated once again with the Democrat Party. So, once again, this lie to believe that Black empowerment comes from these Black movements, and it's a good thing, right? We want Black people to do better. But the automatic assumption leads us to be manipulated once again. Once again, it's social control. It's social control for Blacks, and it's social control for white Americans too. Because one of our weaknesses as Americans is that we're good-willed. And we take people for face value. And they know that, and they use that against us. We don't want to be labeled as racist, bigoted, hateful. They know this. And that's how they use it against us. Once again, it's about politics, social control. That is the fourth and final lie. If you put them all together, and you believe that all these things are the situation at hand, then why wouldn't you believe that white supremacy is the motive for everything that happens in America? I want to go to one big thing, and I stated it before, as far as social control. It's about the government, it's about the elite, it's about the powerful. Race means nothing. This is nothing. There's nothing more special about being Black than white, Indian, whatever, Hispanic, it doesn't matter. I'm a Christian before anything else. And they are using it against us. Multiculturalism is hard to pull off in any country, yet we've been able to pull it off here. And what they're trying to do is reverse it. The government is at play. And just about every historical event that I just read off involved the government at play. And people are using the government against us, against Americans, and especially against Black Americans. Anytime there is anything political that needs to happen in America, they always reference Black Americans. If they want to change the voting laws in Georgia, it's going to disproportionately affect Black Americans. No, it's politics. It's social control. And the problem is that too many Black Americans fall for it. They fall for the tricks. They get to call it Jim Crow 2.0. Why? To instill fear. You don't want this to happen to you again. It's not a reminder, it's a threat. It's about social control. It's about the government being in play. And too many Black Americans trust in the government, trust in their politicians, especially if they're Black, because they've lost the will to look at people for who they are. Too many Black Americans have lost the will to look past race. They used to be Christians. They might call themselves Christians, but they don't act like it. And I know I'm standing here as a Black American, and it sounds like I'm waving my finger at Black Americans. But the truth is the truth. I see it all the time. I see it every day. They would much rather refer to themselves as a black person than a Christian first. I don't do that. I don't care who I stand in front of. I don't care if there's white faces or whatever standing in front of me. Truth is truth, and you are my brothers and my sisters. Before I go, I want to read one last passage. It's from my book as well. It's a chapter titled, The Over-Reliance on Government. The government believes it's helping families by paying single mothers more money per child, but they are incentivizing reckless sexual behavior and careless family planning. The epidemic of fatherless children within the Black community is being subsidized by the same government institutions that claim to care about Black families. The government writes laws restricting access for Black Americans in urban areas from possessing guns legally and making bureaucratic hurdles for law-abiding citizens that make the cost of legal ownership unappealing and unaffordable. How can we have a successful family outcome in such dangerous places, but we are unable to protect ourselves adequately? These questions never get answered because they are inefficient with their care to respond to common sense inquiries. Despite the failures of constant government intervention, many Black Americans are perfectly fine with an ever-growing and intrusive local and federal government. And this last line is the most important. The government hand that feeds you will always find a way to take away from you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adam.
So I'm going to jump right into introducing our, well, actually, I think is there a slide up here right now on the procurement? There you go, right there. He's selling books out in front. So please do it. We've got a couple groups tabling around here, so please do check that out. So on to introducing our next speaker, Dr. James Lindsay. An American-born author, mathematician, and political commentator, Dr. Lindsay has written 6 books spanning a range of subjects, including religion, the philosophy of science, and postmodern theory. Dr. Lindsay is the founder of New Discourses, an organization dedicated to shining the objective light in the subject darkness. Dr. Lindsay is currently promoting the book, Cynical Theories, How Activist Scholarship Made Everything About Race, Gender, and Identity, and Why This Harms Everybody. Dr. Lindsay has been a featured guest on Fox News, Glenn Beck, Joe Rogan, and NPR, and we'll forgive you for NPR. Come on up.
I come with a dance party. Madison, Wisconsin. What a fun place to be in the given context. I mean it. Critical race theory started here, and critical race theory can end here. So, Mike, our first speaker, talked to you about how critical race theory began here in a convent right here off the University of Wisconsin. And it's a fun little point of this history he didn't share with you, that one of the guys who was there, his name's Richard Delgado, he was mentioned, he's been a critical race theorist from before there was critical race theory, University of Alabama, all that. He was there, and in the mid-1990s, he was interviewed about that meeting right here in Madison. And he's describing it. He says, oh, yeah, we were trying to get together. We thought maybe we'd come up with a name for it, blah, blah, blah. And then he says, so we met in that convent. There were crucifixes on the wall, stained glass everywhere. An odd setting for a bunch of Marxists. That's what he said. So I want to summarize some critical race theory for you based on that history. I want to make it real simple. You've probably been gaslit and lied to on this point. You've probably seen Kimberly Crenshaw lie around this point. She was at that meeting. She was one of the Marxists, by the way. She went on Joy Reid's show on MSNBC. Joy Reid asked her straight to her face, We hear all this stuff about critical race theory being Marxist. What do you think? And she got that smile. Well, what you need to know is, and then talked for 2 minutes until the clock ran out. Didn't say once that she was one of the Marxists in the room here in this city that created critical race theory. So that's gaslighting. I'm just going to make it real simple. Critical race theory is race Marxism. 2 words, that's it. And so I'm going to build that case for you, along with giving a little bit more history. So Mike took us back to 1923, and he showed us the pervert George Lukács, who unleashed the sexual mess on Hungary that nearly ruined its country. We have the exact same echoes of that attempting to ruin our country under the brand names of queer theory and gender theory, but that's a talk for a different day. They're linked by intersectionality, so they're not completely separate. I like to think of them as the critical race theory is like the right hand and queer theory is the left hand of what's destroying our culture. They're not always the same in the head. They don't always know what each other's are doing. But critical race theory can actually be traced back. I mean, it can be traced back a long way, but we're going to trace it back all the way back to 1848. So I'm going to go back a little further. I'm going to talk about a man you've probably heard of, Karl Marx. He published a book, Communist Manifesto. And Karl Marx, what you need to understand, had a belief system. Critical race theory is a belief system that extends his belief system. And part of his belief system, he had lots of different views. Part of his belief system was that history progresses along a certain trajectory. It doesn't matter what country you're in. In fact, it could be global. History progresses along a certain trajectory. And what he was concerned about were what are called the material conditions of a society. The material conditions move along the track of history. His belief system was called dialectical materialism, which says that history moves dialectically by looking at the contradictions that arise in the material conditions. And he says there are 6 main stages of history. The first of these stages is called primitive communism. We live in small tribes, and everybody shares because everybody's either family or extended family or has been inducted into the tribe and is part of the extended family. So everybody shares. There's no sense of property. Primitive communism in tribal settings. But then some tribes figure out how to dominate others. We just heard about that in West Africa, for example. And they introduce slavery, and they create a slave economy. And eventually people realize that this is a bad idea, that it's exploitative, that it's violent, that it's evil. And history progresses as the contradictions of slavery, of human ownership, become intolerable through an act of abolition, and you establish these new things called estates. And we have a serf economy, a serf-based estate feudal economy. And sooner or later, people realize, wait a minute, these lords, these landlords are just hoarding all the good stuff, and I work for it. What if I had my own stuff? And so the third stage of history, which is feudalism, gives way to capitalism, where people have their own private property and can exchange it. But there are still contradictions in capitalism. Marx says this didn't solve the problem. There are still intolerable contradictions. For instance, some people are really rich, but there's still poverty. So there are still contradictions to work out. What he said was, well, the working class, the people who are using their labor to create all this wealth and prosperity while being exploited for it and being alienated from their own product, those people are actually just not aware of the fact that they're being exploited, that they're being alienated. And if they were to be awakened from the worker to the proletariat, that they might rise up in that awakened consciousness of the realities of material conditions under capitalism, seize the means of production, found what one of his acolytes a few years later called a dictatorship of the proletariat, and usher humanity into a 5th stage of history called socialism, where there would be a redistribution. The dictatorship of the proletariat would be run by people who are either workers who are awakened with their class consciousness, what it means to be lower class, or they're representatives among the capitalist class who are really the ones who are going to run the show. Lenin comes to mind. This he believed because the people with the right consciousness, for you religious nerds out there, the Gnostics, the people who have the right consciousness are now going to be able to lead society bit by bit until we finally dissolve socialism, we dissolve the state. We have a classless, stateless society where any conflict is no longer class conflict. It's no longer at the level of material conditions. It's just individual to individual. But since everybody has the same consciousness, they'll be able to work out their differences. We'll have lots of leisure time. The machines, the industrial economy will produce for our vital needs, and everybody will get to do things like hunt and fish, and they all speculated about how great it would be and probably have orgies, because that's really what's motivating a lot of these people. It is. And we enter into the sixth and final stage of history, and that's with a capital H, called communism, and that's with a capital C, which is the utopia made on earth. We overcome the contradictory nature of the economic and material conditions of the world, and this was his religious faith, that this is how history worked, and that the life processes of human beings, which is spotting the contradictions and thinking them out through socialist theory, that would enable us to move along history from the capitalism he found himself flung into, in the Heideggerian sense. That's a nerd reference for you. Heidegger went on to help the Nazis. Not a great philosopher, but flung into intolerable conditions and must remake them in another way was his kind of his thing there. And so he believed that if we just let the people who have the consciousness run the countries, run the global society, that they will usher us to a perfect utopia. Through a managed state that's technically a dictatorship, but it's a dictatorship by the right people because they have the right understanding. Now what? Yeah, it didn't work. It didn't work out real well. It turned out that people like Lenin, Stalin, etc., Mao, put themselves as an enlightened bourgeoisie character that was going to lead the revolution because the stupid workers wouldn't do it themselves. Their consciousness wasn't working out, and they ended up slaughtering millions. It's not the best philosophy. In fact, it's the worst philosophy. What I want to tell you, though, is that critical race theory believes the same thing. Same architecture of history with one key difference. And that key difference was articulated in 1995 in a paper by a woman named Gloria Ladson-Billings, in a paper that is, well, she wrote it with William Tate, who's not a woman, I think, and you can never be sure these days. And they wrote this paper called Toward a Critical Race Theory of Education, because it's not in the schools, as you've been told. 1995, Toward a Critical Race Theory of Education. This is 26 years ago. They were already bringing out key texts saying that it's going to go into education. And she wrote in there that the point of critical race theory, and this is a quote, is to make race the central construct for understanding inequality. That's the point of critical race theory. So Marx had a religion that believed history followed a certain track as long as it got led by the people who understood how history follows that track, and they get all the power. But he believed that economic and material conditions were the key way to understand inequality. But if we make race the central construct for understanding inequality, as this critical race theorist in 1995 instructed, then we can do better. That's the premise of critical race theory. That's where critical race theory really comes from. It's actually that simple. And so what do they believe is the path of history? Well, they're a little vague about it. Marx was pretty specific. He was writing in a particular context at a particular time, which is very industrial modernity, which laid things out much more kind of grandly and clearly, whereas critical race theorists kind of waffle a lot, never really get to the point. And what they believe is that, well, history follows the same trajectory. First, you have this kind of anti-racist tribalism. It doesn't matter what tribe you're in, or it doesn't matter what race you are, it just matters what tribe you're in. If you're a member of the tribe, it doesn't matter what you look like. If you got induced into the tribe, if you went through whatever rituals or rites were required to become a member of the tribe, you're a member of the tribe, you're in the family, the end, and racial justice prevails within that tribe. But then people figured out that you can dominate one race over another, particularly Western European powers figured out that slavery could be run and colonialism could be justified in terms of race. This is why they hate Western civilization, by the way. That's the ones that they blame for figuring this out. And slave economies, or slave race relations, I should say, came to dominate the way that the world thought about race. Eventually, this became intolerable. We go through abolition, we come out the other side of abolition, and we enter into a state of apartheid or segregation in Jim Crow. This is like feudal estates. You now have an upper class and a lower class, and the lower class is subject to the upper class's whims. Eventually, though, you have a civil rights movement, and the civil rights movement creates colorblind equality, which is exactly what the United States brought that whole idea into the world in 1776 in all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Finally, we realize this in the 1960s, and we enter into a colorblind equal society, stage 4 of racial history. But they say that colorblindness is in fact not sufficient. Colorblindness doesn't produce equal outcomes. There are still intolerable racial contradictions. We're equal, but why are some races doing worse on average than others? It must be that equality and colorblindness themselves are part of the problem. And so if we awaken a racial consciousness in parallel to class consciousness that helps people to understand that this is the nature of the world that they live in, and we start handing the power to the people with the racial consciousness, then we can enter into a new phase of history that starts to right those wrongs, and we call that phase equity, racial equity, socialism, but by race. It seeks reparations to remake the wrongs of history. It seeks redistribution to even the playing field, and it will be administered by commissars like diversity consultants who are trained in diversity, and inclusion experts and equity experts that rule over your businesses, your churches, your everything, your schools, all of that. In other words, critical race theorists will run the society. They will manage the society with not a dictatorship of the proletariat. Remember when Mike told us what Herbert Marcuse recognized, by the way, in the essay that he referenced where he quotes about the ghetto populations, he mentions it like 30 times in there, is the essay on liberation from 1969. And he actually does say, I found my new proletariat. He does. He says, my new proletariat is this. The new vanguard is going to be the elite college student intellectuals, the leftist intelligentsia, and they're going to infiltrate into the minority and ghetto populations and train them to be the revolutionaries to bring us to this new stage. That's literally what he says. So these critical race theorists become the dictatorship not of the proletariat, but of the anti-racists. And then eventually, should we give them enough power long enough and total enough over everybody and everybody's thoughts and over society itself, then we'll enter into a sixth utopian stage where the end of history has been achieved, the end of racial history has been achieved, called racial justice. This is why when you saw Derek Chauvin found guilty on 3 counts, the immediate response from AOC, the squad, Bernie Sanders, and half the rest of the left politicians were, this is not justice, this is merely accountability. Justice is the end of the race communist rainbow. We don't get there till they have their dictatorship and all the contradictions are worked out. Now you think perhaps that I exaggerate, because you will not find that written in the critical race theory literature anywhere. That's not real critical race theory. Probably Lindsay made it up. I just want to impress upon you, though, that this dictatorship of the anti-racist thing is absolutely the agenda that they are pushing, not only in the corporations like Vivek talked about, and in churches, as many of you will know, not only in schools, as all of us are keenly aware, but through the government as well. And I'm not just talking about Biden's equity plans and all of this other junk. I'm not talking about the rantings of the squad. I'm not talking about anything. I'm just going to read to you in I'm old. 2019, there's where the 19 actually came from, I'm not that old. They asked Ibram Kendi, Politico magazine is the they, asked Ibram Kendi, how do you fix inequality? And they let him write a paragraph. And he said, pass an anti-racist constitutional amendment. That's his answer. This is very famous. A lot of people have heard this. Pass an anti-racist constitutional amendment. That's his thing. So pause for a minute to appreciate that the Constitution is the almighty law of this land. All other law at every level, everywhere, always is subject to the Constitution as it is amended at the present time. So he wants to create a constitutional amendment consistent with anti-racism. So let me read this paragraph to you. I will convince you in this single paragraph from him, that they are seeking a dictatorship of the anti-racists. It's very, very simple. He says, to fix the original sin, I told you it's a belief system, to fix the original sin of racism, America should pass an anti-racist amendment to the U.S. Constitution that enshrines two guiding anti-racist principles. He misspells principles, by the way. It's the pal at your school that he put in the thing. As you will know, Dr. Kendi is a genius, as you'll also hear with his plan to solve inequality. These two principles are racist inequity is evidence of racist policy. That's one of the four lies we just heard. That, in fact, is the main incentive structure that they have operating on their behalf right now, and it's the result of bad jurisprudence that said that disparate impact can be treated as proof of discrimination. So we have excellent civil rights laws that are interpreted overbroad by a bad Supreme Court decision that allows this principle to already be jurisprudence in the United States, even though it's not yet an amendment. He secondly says that the different racial groups are equals. That's, of course, in the Declaration of Independence, so we can kind of gloss over that. The amendment would make unconstitutional racial inequity over a certain threshold. Different outcomes by race on average, unconstitutional, should this guy get his way. As well as racist ideas by public officials. Racist ideas are unconstitutional. Freedom of belief in the First Amendment? Sorry. It would establish and permanently fund, and I'm not kidding, the Department of Anti-Racism, DOA. You can barely, the guy's a genius. The guy is a genius. Comprised of formally trained experts on racism and no political appointees. Formally trained experts on racism, critical race theorists. Give them the power of the DOA. What would this DOA do? The DOA would be responsible for pre-clearing all local, state, and federal public policies to ensure they won't yield racial inequity. Dictatorship. Absolute authority over every law at every level. But that's not all. Not just pre-clearing all local, state, and federal public policies, but also to monitor those policies, investigate private racist policies when racial inequity surfaces, and monitor public officials for expressions of racist ideas. Monitor public officials, intervene in private enterprise, have absolute authority over all local, state, and federal policies. Dictatorship of the anti-racist. Funny, DOA. How about that? The dictatorship of the anti-racist, he put DOA. The dictatorship of the anti-racist would be empowered with the disciplinary tools to wield over and against policymakers and public officials who do not voluntarily change their racist policies and ideas. Could you get more Soviet, Dr. Kendi? So, I hope that alone, his own words, is sufficient to convince you, despite the long history. Yeah, there's a bunch of Marxists here in Madison that decided to start this stuff by their own admission. The links to the neo-Marxists that Mike talked about in detail that I'll gloss over for the time, I usually talk about them. I'm going to skip them today. I will tell you, just as a side note, the weather has been a bit dodgy, and Mike was talking about his bottles of Excedrin. So I was flying in here yesterday in that thunderstorm. Like, it's like this, and it's like this, and it's like I'm trying to read literally freaking Herbert Marcuse. That guy. On the plane, I'm trying to read it, and it's like this, and I can't do it. It's like, well, hold on, let me make it more realistic for you. It's like this, right? I got the phone. It's just like I can't read it because it's like the lightning is everywhere, and I'm looking out the window, not able to read Marcuse like it's fun. I'm having so much fun, though, reading Marcuse that I see the lightning right down by the plane, and I'm like, could have got a little closer. Like you could have just finished it, but no. We landed, the pilot was like, I can't believe we made it. And I'm like, no, really, that happened. And I was like, I was reading Marcuse, you could have just not. It's really unpleasant. But I'm going to gloss over them. And I've just read from the people now, linking back to the fact that they said from the beginning that they're a bunch of Marxists. Reading from the guy now that they're hoping to establish what amounts to a dictatorship of the anti-racists. And the belief is that if they give these people power over your private life, over your private company, over your faith, over your family, over the law, over our government at every single level, then racial justice lies at the end of the race communist rainbow. So what is critical race theory? Race communism. That's it. The end. That's what it is. The DOA, that's right. It's also DOA. And we're going to be DOA if it gets the A. If it arrives, we're in trouble. And so this is actually a poignant moment to tell you, Vivek gave an awesome speech at the end. He pivoted to solutions. I need to tell you, you need to realize the moment of history that you live in. The solutions really do come from us, all of us. Because we live in a moment of history in which we are living through a cultural revolution that uses primarily anti-racism, though we can get into the queer theory stuff another time. That's there too. A bunch of them all at once. We are living through a cultural revolution right now, and the only country that's repelled one successfully was Russia by taking dictatorial powers, which is not the path we want to go. But I think, like Vivek, that America is exceptional in this way. I think that we have a stronger culture. I think we have stronger bones. I think we have better values. And I think we can repel it. Repelling critical race theory, repelling this cultural revolution requires all of us to know the moment of history that we occupy. We didn't ask to be stuck in this moment of history, but we have to fight. And we have to fight, like Vivek said, without using the tools of the enemy. We have to fight clean. We have to hold our heads high. We have to stick to our principles. So Vivek actually was really great. He set me right up. It's perfect. But so did Mike. So I'm going to dip to Mike first, and we'll go to Vivek, then we'll close this thing up. So Mike talked about these cultural Marxists in 1923, Lukács, funded by Wheel, and all these troublemakers in Germany. But what these guys, along with their Italian counterpart named Antonio Gramsci, understood was that Western culture is strong. It is very effective. I was going to say just ineffective. It is a very effective repellent to communist ideology. Herbert Marcuse, who I didn't get to go down on the plane with, Herbert Marcuse talks endlessly about the idea that the stupid prosperity of Western civilization made people happy so they don't realize their servitude. They like their lives, but they're actually miserable, but they refuse to know it. He called it misery, and he called it something like euphoria in misery or something like this. You're euphoric, but you're actually miserable. And that's what he's going to liberate you from, him and his new left army that created critical legal studies that unleashed critical race theory into the world. What they understood was that the cultural values of the West, that made the West what the West is, are strong repellents to communism, to any of this kind of Marxist thought. Westerners don't want it because we value freedom. As Solzhenitsyn warned, they said that Alexander Solzhenitsyn says, we didn't value freedom enough, so we deserved everything that came after, writing about the gulags under the Soviets. Freedom is key. Our values are key. So, now that I've dipped back to history with Mike, we can go forward to Vivek. And he says, we don't have a good answer right now to what it means to be American. In 2021, we can look at the flag, we can feel proud, but we don't have that good answer. This is what I told a group of kids recently talking for Turning Point. I said, you have to have a positive vision of what it means to be American. Where do you want this country to go, and how do you want to help it get there? But it's not just for kids. It's not just for young people. This is for all of us. So we have to start to articulate, just like Vivek said, we have to start articulating those values. We have to answer that question. I'm not going to stand here before you and just say, oh, this is the answer. I'm just going to tell you a few hints, like everybody else has said. We've got to figure this answer out together, though. We've got to figure out, what does 21st century America look like? What are those values? And how do we start to live and embody and spread them so that we can repel this threat to our republic? And I think, Adam touched on it beautifully. I think it's so important to realize the truth is the truth no matter who does it. I come from the sciences. One of the core principles of science, like real science, not like the science. Not the science on CNN. One of the core principles, well, I'll tell you, no, really, because one of the core principles of science is called universality, which means that it doesn't matter who does the experiment. The result's going to be the same. See, so when Fauci does the experiment, like this week and next week and the next week, the results are not always the same. That's the science. That's not science. But what that's speaking to is that the truth is the truth independent of who says it. Vivek says that we should replace things like diversity with excellence. I fully believe in this. One of my favorite ideas is the Greek ideal of arete. I didn't say that right. Arete, A-R-E-T-E. I can spell it. I'm bad at words. I have the worst words. Believe me. Whatever. So, arete is the idea of excellence that the Greeks aspired to. Excellence produces merit, competence, that we can each use our time and our talents to achieve something, to build something in the world. We can anchor ourselves to truth and excellence. These are powerful values. They're at the heart of the American experiment. I think we also need to be paying attention not just to the idea of excellence and truth, but also to that evil twin, not evil really, twin of that hard twin, the bad cop twin of liberty, which is responsibility. You want an anti-woke value? Responsibility. I have a friend, I won't name him because I don't know if he wants to be named, but I want to mention him so it doesn't look like I'm stealing his thunder. I have a friend who says that he's never, and he's a very successful professional man, and never in his entire life met a person in whom wokeness and responsibility coincide. So we have a responsibility toward truth. We have a responsibility toward excellence. These are values. These are starting places. And so the last thing, this is a thing I'm kind of on about lately, and Vivek really talked about it, really tapped into it. Adam's talk really connected with it. It's very, very important. And we understand what critical theory is. You understand that it's the antithesis of this. We need, in the 1770s, we had Thomas Paine writing Common Sense. In the 2020s, we need common sensibility coming back. Critical theories analyze everything through power dynamics. The current ones are all, like critical race theory, do it through identity politics-based power dynamics. There's no common sensibility possible if I have to analyze the truth or falsity or value or worth or moral valence of a statement based on who the person happens to be who said it. There's no common sensibility possible there. Instead, they replace a common sensibility where we understand ourselves as one people with shared goals, shared visions that don't always have to be the same goal. Like you doing your thing and me doing my thing and us meeting in the middle is a great shared goal. And when we decide to team up, we've teamed up. We're not forced together. They replace that with solidarity, where you are forced together into collectivism. And so I think what we need to be thinking about is how do we find that new common sensibility? It's not even finding it. How do we remember it? How do we remember a common sensibility that doesn't rely on analyzing the power dynamics in every single thing and the who, the identity first thinking of identity politics? That's absolutely key. And I think that the answer to where a common sensibility lies is in what I just said, and what Vivek talked about, and what the other gentlemen talked about, which is finding those common values that we can orient ourselves to. Everybody claps when Adam says that he's a Christian because they know it's common values we can all orient ourselves to. Rooted in truth, rooted in excellence, rooted in taking responsibility. You've been faithful over a few things. Let me make you master over many. Take responsibility. So to kind of tie this up, just to be real simple, critical race theory is race Marxism, which means it's a belief system that believes that the fundamental organizing principle of society is systemic racism created by white people for their own benefit. There's your actual succinct, easy definition. You can write it down from the tape. That's a real one. So it's race Marxism based on that belief. It is a belief system, I'll say it one more time for you, that believes that racism is the fundamental organizing principle of society and that it was organized and is maintained by white people for their own benefit. It scapegoats whiteness. Just admit it. It does. We don't have to dance around other races, blah, blah, blah. It scapegoats whiteness. It just does. Black people who speak up, they're acting white, like Obama was. So we have this, we know what it is, that tells us we must know what moment in history we occupy right now, which is the attempted Marxian takeover of our society, which we get to blame on Madison. Sorry, you guys, you did it. Just kidding. Some Marxists that you guys had here did it. So you have to understand in the moment that we live in history. And then we have to understand, when we understand that moment, that there are cures to this. There's a Polish proverb I talk about all the time, never attempt to cure what you don't understand. When you understand this moment as an attempted Marxian takeover of America and Western civilization, you can then start to find an answer. And we find the answer by reverse engineering their own strategy. Their strategy was to infiltrate our cultural institutions, to take them over from within, because they knew our values were strong, and if they could get inside them and subvert them by dragging people away from truth, by dragging them away from excellence, and dragging them away from responsibility into solidarity-based dependency, then they could ruin the civilization. And so all we have to do is start to articulate those values and then start to show up and show those values and fight for those values and make sure that our institutions that they've stolen from us can be recaptured by reinfusing them with those values, by putting people in who understand that those values matter. If we can do that, we can get over this idea of a dictatorship of the anti-racists. We can prevent them from having that evil power, which, by the way, spoiler, it's not going to work this time either. Yeah, like just take Marxism, which didn't work, and make it racist. It'll work better, I'm sure, right? Come on. We can resist this attempted dictatorship of the anti-racists. We can get our country back on track to e pluribus unum, that we are many who have come together, despite our differences, to work together in this awesome values and ideas-based experiment symbolized by that flag. And all it takes is for us to wake up and be willing to do it, to show up, be there, and hold those values tight and teach them to our kids. Thank you.
Let's hear it for all of our speakers again. Thank you. Thank you all, and thank you for coming here. So I know it's hot. I know you all brave tornado watches and all the rest of it. I will have a quick close, and we'll send you out of here for the evening. So I asked you all at the outset, as you listen to our speakers tonight, ask yourself, can a republic governed by free people continue to persist if its politicians, its educators, and its corporate leaders continue to tell us that we should hate each other and distrust each other? Do you think that we can? The answer, well, we can, but that's because we will fight back. Is that correct? Yes, and we will. But ultimately, the proponents of CRT, they understand that if they continue to push this line, they will undermine the actual existence of this republic because, again, this system of government was not made to persist with our leaders consistently lying to us and pitting us against each other on the basis of our race. So I do urge you going forward, please do check out that handout that we gave to you. Use that website, forward it to other people who are asking questions about critical race theory and what they can do. You'll see resources coming from our speakers tonight that we're sharing with you. Beyond that, I encourage you to support school board members and legislators who are advocating for the teaching of reality, warts and all, as long as it is presented accurately and with full context. Because any contextual teaching of history and world history would, at the end of the day, remind our children that whatever the flaws of our society, that billions have and still aspire to come to America, and there is a reason for that. What's more, I encourage you to back legislation that demands that educational curriculums be put online, that they be transparent, that frankly, too, that teacher trainings be put online as well. Always remember that sunlight is the best disinfectant, and nobody should shy away from these suggestions unless they have something to hide. But most of all, join us in No Better Friend as we move to the fight. It's what I was trained to do as a Marine. I see a fight forward. We will fight for this country, and we have your back. So use us as a resource. Remember, I will tell you, we're here in Dane County because we came to a meeting, and as I talked about the poison of critical race theory, a couple members of that meeting stood up. And they're here tonight. I don't want to recognize them because they may not want to be called out. But they stood up and said, we need you to come to Dane County and do something. Well, did we come to Dane County and do something? You bet. So remember that about us. At No Better Friend, we got your back. We are your friend, and we're going to continue to fight for this country. Have faith in our system of government, our society, and keep fighting forward. God bless you all, and thanks for coming tonight.